Recently, I was sitting in the audience at a conference on global security, listening to a woman recount her experience on October 7th, when her great-niece was kidnapped by Hamas.
And did everything I could to get Abigail and 240 hostages freed. After Abigail was kidnapped, she was released.
When her story was finished, she had someone to thank for Abigail's release.
I am in great appreciation for the United States President Joe Biden.
And someone else.
To the Qatari leadership, to His Excellency the Prime Minister Al Thani, for the mediation and the work that they did.
She thanked the ruler of Qatar, a small country in the Persian Gulf, about the size of Connecticut. In recent years, little Qatar has taken an outsized role in global affairs. 2 years ago, President Joe Biden named Qatar a major non-NATO ally to the US. And today, it's at the center of ending the world's most controversial war by serving as a mediator between Israel and Hamas. Actually, this conference I was attending, it took place in Qatar. World leaders, top journalists, and national security experts converge there every year.
And I'm a reporter for the New York Times.
Leads the National Counterterrorism Center.
You're the lead negotiator right now between Hamas and the Israelis.
Just a few decades ago, Qatar was a desert wilderness with not much in the way of business other than some limited oil fields and diving for pearls.
No one forgets that it all started with the pearls that were fished from the water's depths at the price of considerable effort.
That all changed after massive natural gas reserves were discovered, which fueled a sovereign wealth fund that now has some $500 billion. That's allowed Qatar to make some major purchases.
Qatar's royal family has bought the iconic Italian fashion house Valentino.
Qatar buying the Plaza Hotel, $600 million.
A landmark in New York City.
It sure is.
They bought up the tallest building in the country, the Shard.
This is all in addition to a diversified real estate portfolio that makes the state of Qatar the largest single property owner in London.
And in a stunning victory for the tiny desert nation, it won the biggest bid in global sports in 2010.
The winner to organize the 2022 FIFA World Cup is Qatar.
Qatar is also home to one of the most successful and controversial media outlets in the world.
This is Al Jazeera, live from Doha. Also coming up, thousands of refugees.
Buying a fashion brand, hosting a major sporting event, snapping up some posh real estate. Well, that's one thing, but why didn't Qatar just stop there? Why launch a controversial global news organization? Why choose to put itself at the center of conflict resolution in one of the most conflict-dense regions of the world? And what kind of a risk is Qatar taking by insisting that it be at the center of the action? And on the flip side, would it be riskier for this small country in a dangerous neighborhood just to do nothing at all? I'm Peter Bergen. This is In the Room. Can you just describe what we're looking at here?
What we're looking at here is part of the downtown area. So this is the Corniche, the main road along the water.
This is Rami Khoury, a journalist who's reported in the Middle East for 5 decades. Khoury was among the speakers at that global security conference. During a break, we chatted on my hotel balcony overlooking downtown Doha.
But you see a lot of Qataris walking along the Corniche in the evenings, on the weekends. They've got a lot of marinas for rich people and boats and stuff like that. And then the next step is average Qataris, because not all Qataris are wealthy. To have average middle-class families be able to enjoy access to the water, to the beach.
You know, in Europe, there were so-called enlightened despots. It was still an absolute monarchy, but they were trying to do things for their people.
I think most monarchs probably feel that they have to be aware of their people's needs and sentiments, because if they totally ignore them, it might come back and kick you in the ass.
Right.
So if you're in a wealthy country and people's fundamental needs are met, they have water, they have electricity, their kids go to school, that makes a big difference in calming people down. But When you do that, you've satisfied people's material needs. They then have other needs. They want to be involved in sharing and decision-making. But I think the Qataris have done a pretty good job of finding the balance between allowing people to develop their talents if they want, but then if they want to create a political party and install a socialist system, they probably would get some pushback.
One of the things that makes Qatar a little unusual among its neighbors in the Persian Gulf is its embrace of intellectual inquiry. I had the chance to visit Education City, which includes the campuses of 6 prestigious American universities, including Carnegie Mellon, Cornell, Northwestern, and Georgetown, where young men and women were studying together, not unlike what they would be doing at the Georgetown main campus in Washington, D.C. I'm following you.
Okay, so we can head back towards Dr.
My tour guide told me why Qatar had sought out Georgetown in the first place.
You'll see what's unique about here in Education City is they only have universities that are among the best in the disciplines they teach anywhere else in the world.
Yeah, and of course, Georgetown School of Foreign Service is the best in the United States. For a lot of people who are listening to this, who may not have had as much time in the Gulf as you, how surprising is it that you have universities like Georgetown, Northwestern, Carnegie Mellon, operating as normal universities in a Gulf kingdom?
It is unusual for the Gulf and for the whole Arab region. Doha is the most impressive because it was spending a couple of $1 billion a year on institutions that train and allow people to use their minds. Universities, libraries, cultural centers, museums, institutions that really can do serious research, hold meetings, public meetings where people are invited to discuss political issues. The Qataris have persisted on this path, and they allow what I call serious scholarships at the universities and research centers, which is not, provocatively threatening to the system.
I always have a hard time describing Qatar to people who haven't been here.
Mehran Kamrava is a political scientist and the author of Qatar, Small State, Big Politics. He's been teaching at Georgetown's Doha campus for 17 years.
One of the ways that I've kind of tried to describe it is that it's some sort of a hybrid between Tucson, Arizona, and Hong Kong in terms of its very densely populated areas and also its desert landscape.
He described the frenetic pace at which the city is reshaping itself.
There's constant construction going on. This kind of preoccupation with remaking the city. As soon as a road is built, it's dug up, it's torn up. The city, it's expanding into the desert, it's expanding into the sea, and it's expanding into the sky in ways that would have been difficult to imagine 20, 30, and of course 40 years ago.
The extent of Qatar's fossil fuel riches was discovered late compared to its neighbors. It wasn't until 1972 that the world's largest natural gas reserves were discovered in an area that spans Qatar and Iran. Those gas reserves are nearly as large as Qatar itself. It took more than 2 decades to bring that gas to market, and that's when Qatar's economy began to take flight, and with it, its role on the global stage.
Up until 1995, Qatar really didn't play an active role regionally, globally, or internationally. And we had a leadership transition in 1995 when former Emir of Qatar, Sheikh Hamad bin Khalifa, overthrew his father and started a series of major reforms, steadily started playing to a global audience.
That included founding Al Jazeera, the Arabic and English language news organization, an organization the George W. Bush administration hated.
What Al Jazeera is doing is vicious, inaccurate, and inexcusable.
In fact, at one point, President Bush even mused, maybe as a joke, maybe not, about bombing Al Jazeera's offices in Doha. And during the Bush administration, the US was so angry over Al Jazeera's coverage of al-Qaeda that it considered pulling all its troops out of Qatar unless the country reined in the network. That would have been a huge undertaking. The US military base in Qatar is the biggest US military installation in the Middle East, with over 8,000 US service members stationed there today. The US started using that base heavily after the 9/11 attacks, and that marked an important turning point for Qatar, Mehran Kamrava, the political scientist, says, because for a small country with a tiny military, its protection by the US was now assured.
That's when Qatar really has its moment in history. It begins to project influence, power, try and shape the destinies of a number of countries in the region.
Despite the fact that Qatar has this large US military base, it also has close ties with its neighbor, Iran. Kamrava says this all makes sense if you put yourself in Qatar's shoes for a minute. You're this little country with scant military power, and you find yourself sitting on the world's biggest gusher of natural gas. What's to stop your more powerful neighbors from swallowing you up?
For a small country, there aren't too many options in terms of what foreign policy line to adopt. What Qatar does is to kind of place your bet in multiple different directions. You kind of place your security bet one way, and then you place a bunch of smaller bets another way. In other words, what you try and do is to have as many friends as possible and as few adversaries as possible. You maintain open lines of communication with everybody. You are more friendly with some than with others, but you talk to the Americans, you talk to the European Union, but you also don't alienate the Iranians, and you maintain open lines of communication with the Iranians. And that's what Qatar has done. It has tried to hedge its bet.
But Qatar's attempts to gain allies as well as global clout through fashion brands and real estate hasn't always been well regarded. During the lead up to the World Cup, it was accused of sports washing, the attempt to use the pomp and circumstances of the global soccer event to distract from Qatar's less savory qualities. The country, for example, has been funding Hamas for years, and conditions for migrant workers who perform the jobs that wealthy Qataris won't do are often exploitative.
Qatar's treatment of migrant workers has been one of the main controversies of this World Cup.
So, if Qatar was trying to sports wash its reputation, it may have put its cleat in its mouth. The event drew massive news coverage, including of the dangerous, even lethal conditions for the migrant workers who flocked there from countries like India, Kenya, and Nepal to build the enormous infrastructure.
We have not received any salary for months and cannot send money home. Neither the labor court nor the embassy helps us.
And there was plenty of evidence that bribery helped steer the selection process that brought the World Cup to Qatar in the first place. Qatari organizers denied involvement. But Qatar has been more successful in its bid to showcase its prowess as a mediator, sometimes helping to rescue hostages or even trying to stop wars. One of their first efforts as a mediator was in 2004, when they helped negotiate the release of 2 French journalists who were held in Iraq by a terrorist group.
My impression is that the Qataris decided some years ago they didn't have the money. They have a lot of money, but they didn't have enough money to buy everybody off. They didn't have the military power. They don't have the great cultural or other influences. So they needed to find ways in which they became not just useful, but indispensable to other people. The negotiation stuff that they do, which they have done it in many places. They've done it in Lebanon, they've tried it in Sudan. They're trying to really develop an expertise and a credibility in that respect. And that requires that they have good relations with everybody. You can't be a mediator if you can't talk to everybody, because you never know who you're going to mediate between.
Qatar's allies also include the Islamist Muslim Brotherhood, which Qatar supported in Egypt during the Arab Spring. Political scientist Kamrava says that in Egypt that turned out to be a bad bet because the Muslim Brotherhood proved to be incompetent at governing the country. But the Qataris continue to have their reasons for retaining good relations with the Muslim Brotherhood.
There's this assumption by Qatari leaders that insofar as the future of the Middle East is concerned, political Islam has a role to play, much the same way that Christianity has played a historical role in the political life of Europe. And so one way to moderate political Islam is to enable it to take part in the political process. Qatar is the only state that I know of in the greater Middle East that does not have an Islamist opposition. And you got to ask yourself, why is that the case? And the reason that's the case is because the state has pursued such carefully calibrated policy towards political Islam in a way that the population looks at the state and says, you know what, unlike the Egyptian state, unlike the Emirati state, unlike the Bahraini or the Saudi or any of the other states, this is not a state that is innately opposed to political Islam. And in that sense, it's a tremendous source of political capital for the Qatari state not to have a religious opposition domestically.
In 2017, Qatar reached another turning point. After Donald Trump was elected US president, he made his first international trip as president, not to a close democratic ally like Mexico or Canada, as is traditional, but to Saudi Arabia, Qatar's much bigger neighbor. Trump shared the Saudis' view that Qatar should break its ties with Iran, and he seemed to give several Arab countries the green light to put the squeeze on Qatar.
Several countries have cut ties with Qatar, accusing it of fostering terrorism, allegations Qatar vehemently denies.
The 2017 rift really was an effort to bring the young Qatari leadership in line with Saudi priorities. At that time, there was a huge rift between Saudi Arabia and Iran.
The bloc, led by Saudi Arabia, issued Qatar a list of 13 demands.
One of the main objectives was for Qatar to break its relations with Iran. Another was to get rid of Al Jazeera. Those 13 demands that were presented to Qatar in 2017 were meant to be rejected. They were unimplementable.
So Qatar's neighbors blockaded the country, cutting it off from key supply chains overnight. Here's Saudi Minister Abdul Al-Jubair in 2018 defending the blockade.
It's just we don't want to have anything to do with them. The Qataris, since the mid-90s, have been sponsoring radicals. The Qataris harbor and shelter terrorists. That's not acceptable.
The blockade seemed like a serious threat to everyday life. After all, at the time, Qatar imported 90% of its food.
Qatar turned out to be more resilient, and so they had made other arrangements already with the Turks, with the Iranians, in terms of flyover rights over Iranian airspace.
That included some flying cows.
What to do when Saudi Arabia cuts your yogurt, milk, and cheese supply? If you're an enterprising Qatari business, you buy dairy cows, 4,000 of them, from the United States and Australia.
They're going to be loaded en masse into multiple 747s.
Incredibly, in the middle of the desert, with virtually no naturally occurring fresh water, Qatar was able to get a dairy industry successfully up and running.
We are already self-sufficient 1 year after.
And I'm told this factory will soon be run by robots.
The blockade of Qatar by several Arab states lasted for more than 3 years. But in the end, Qatar didn't budge on its relations with Iran or its funding of Al Jazeera. And despite its seeming bad blood with the Trump administration, Qatar continued to act in a mediator role, serving as the venue for talks between the United States and the Taliban in 2019, even as the blockade dragged on. Finally, in 2021, the blockade on Qatar was lifted.
the Trump administration was leaving office. And so that unconditional support from the United States that had been so instrumental in driving the blockade was no longer there. And then in some ways, the Qataris turned out to be much more resilient and resourceful than really anybody anticipated. Life went on as usual, and it turned out that the blockade didn't necessarily work in the same way that Saudi Arabia, Bahrain, and the UAE anticipated.
Since then, Qatar has continued to carve out a role as a mediator on the global stage. In May, at the Global Security Forum, Qatar was quite literally center stage as its lead negotiator in the Gaza war, Minister Mohammed bin Abdulaziz Al Khulaifi, spoke with the American journalist Steve Clemens in front of a packed audience.
How complex is that for you serving as a mediator to the different sides? Are you not perceived by Israel to be a host of Hamas, a friend of Hamas? How do you convince both parties to trust you?
What makes Qatar a unique mediator are several important factors. One of which, Qatar's at start doesn't believe in the impossible mission for mediation. As you know, historically, we have dealt with extremely difficult and complex mediation cases. Taliban in the US, as an example of those very difficult scenarios. Another important factor that we're doing is that crises today, Stephen, are extremely complicated. It's way different than 10 years or even 20 years before. So which requires Qatar to equip its team with the right amount of expertise.
Admittedly, that all sounds kind of vague, but we're talking about the delicate negotiations for a ceasefire in Gaza and releasing hostages held by Hamas, the exact details of which are all very closely held. In fact, it was remarkable that Qatar put its chief negotiator on a stage at all. Ken Brava, the Georgetown political scientist, filled in a few more details about what sets Qatar apart in its approach.
There's a very small inner circle of people in Qatar that make foreign policy, and that gives them tremendous agility. And that small inner circle, which can respond to crises quickly, tends to also be extremely wealthy. And so they have tremendous resources at their disposal and, quite frankly, a lot of persuasion power with their wealth to kind of persuade others to see the world the way they want them to see. Qataris do it in a distinctively Qatari way, making sure everyone knows Qatar is involved, making sure everybody knows Qatar was the party that effected release of hostages or prisoner swap, or was the one that resulted in the success of the mediation efforts. And sometimes that has succeeded, and sometimes it hasn't, because certain cases require discretion, and the parties that are involved don't necessarily want the outside world to know that they're negotiating together. So I think in this sense, Qatar's track record has been mixed, quite frankly.
Qatar's attempts to serve as a mediator for conflicts going on in Lebanon, Sudan, and Yemen have been something of a mixed bag. And some see the country as playing a dangerous double game of supporting forces that are in opposition to each other. No case illustrates this more starkly than their role in negotiating between Israel and Hamas. The headquarters of Hamas's political arm is located in Qatar, a location that was encouraged by the United States. And in 2018, Qatar also started sending Hamas millions of dollars for humanitarian purposes. By some estimates, Qatar has sent Hamas more than $1 billion. Common sense would tell you that some of that funding inevitably gets spent on Hamas's military operation. And in a bizarre twist, it turns out that Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu was on board for this funding.
Is reporting that the Netanyahu government was aware of and approved of millions of dollars in aid to Hamas from the government of Qatar in the mistaken belief it would buy them off and prevent a terror attack.
The fact that Qatar houses Hamas political leadership here in Doha has been extremely costly in terms of Qatar's reputation, particularly in European capitals, with this assumption that Qatar houses terrorists and it's a benefactor and a sponsor of a terrorist organization like Hamas. But we all know that Hamas wouldn't be here if the Qataris hadn't gotten a green light from the United States.
So why has the United States given Qatar that green light?
The fact that Hamas is here enables the Americans to keep close eyes on it and keep close tabs on it. Whereas if Hamas were in Damascus or Tehran or somewhere in Lebanon, it'd be much more difficult for the US to have the same degree of awareness of Hamas movements and what the political leadership at least is up to. One thing that I think is quite important to keep in mind is that at a larger level, Qatari foreign policy tends to be extremely pragmatic and non-ideological. As a small state, Qatar cannot afford to be ideological. And so it's always been extremely pragmatic. And that pragmatism is driven by not only regime survival, but national interests. And if Qatar at some point realizes that housing Hamas is contrary to its national interests or undermines its security arrangements with the United States, it would, of course, get rid of Hamas or ask Hamas leadership to leave and go elsewhere.
Is there something inherently wrong with this kind of pragmatism if it means you align yourself with whatever force is the most beneficial at this particular moment? Journalist Steve Clemons put a version of this question to Qatar's lead negotiator with Hamas at the Global Security Conference.
I think one of the criticisms that some have of Qatar and the role you play is that you're not out there judging right from wrong among some of the parties you're dealing with. How do you navigate that? And how do you tell the critics of Qatar why that's important?
Stephen, we totally distinguish between our pure political position when it comes to the cases that are surrounding us and our mediation efforts when it comes to the scope that we have already designed for that specific mediation. When it comes to the political position, we're standing with the rule of law. Now, when it comes to the mediation, we're also following the international law. We design our work very professionally, and we make sure that we illustrate to each party their obligations and their rights when it comes to those mediation efforts. Therefore, we cannot really mix up these two things together when it comes to the political position. History always teaches us, Stephen, that referring to violence or the threat of using violence is never going to resolve the disputes. And the best methods that we have selected is really to refer those matters to more diplomacy and peaceful methods of resolving disputes.
But journalist Steve Clemons had good reason to ask. This theme comes up again and again about Qatar. So whose side are you on? Is it ethical to be kind of agnostic when the Middle East is on fire with a raging war in Gaza, a looming war potentially between Lebanese Hezbollah and Israel, an Iranian proxy shooting missiles at ships in the Red Sea that has greatly interfered with global trade? At least one American university in Qatar, Texas A&M, seems to have decided that it's not comfortable with this ambiguity. They recently announced they'll be pulling out of Qatar, citing vaguely worded concerns about heightened regional instability. Some say you can read Qatar's true point of view via Al Jazeera, the news organization that's funded by Qatar and was started by a bunch of former BBC journalists back in 1996.
They see the world from the point of view of the voiceless or the people on the ground. They say, we go cover stories from where the bombs are falling, not from where the bombs were sent.
Rami Khoury, the journalist who I met up with in Doha, is an occasional contributor to Al Jazeera's website and a frequent guest on its air. This decision to fund and house Al Jazeera doesn't come without political costs for the Qataris. They didn't have to do it. On the other hand, it is the most credible source of independent news coverage on the television side and arguably on the internet side anywhere in the Arab world. So how unusual is it to have a quite independent and also muscular media organization based in a Gulf state?
It's very unusual. It's unique. There's nobody else like it. Others tried. I remember when Jazeera started, others, Dubai, Abu Dhabi, people in Jordan tried it, people in Lebanon and other places, but none of them could achieve the quality of Jazeera, and none of them really had the freedom to do what Jazeera was doing.
And does it come with a political cost?
It comes with the same cost that any institution like it living in a non-democratic country has. In Qatar, this means obviously the same as in every country in the Arab world and in most of the world, that you don't report on the life and policies and whatever of the ruling powers, whether it's a ruling family or a wider power elite.
I also spoke to Hussein Abdul Hussein, a research fellow at the Pro-Israel Foundation for Defense of Democracies, a research institute based in D.C. He says that Qatar is actually more radical than it wants the international community to believe, and his critique starts with Al Jazeera.
Let me put it this way. It's just spreading ideas that I think don't help improve things in the region.
Meaning what?
Meaning the language they use. So, for example, when they're reporting on the war in Gaza, they describe those killed on the Palestinian side, whoever they are, as martyrs elevated to heaven. But when they're reporting on the Israelis, they're just killed.
We checked on this, and Abdul Hussein is largely right when it comes to Al Jazeera's Arabic language content, which is distinct from its English language content. That said, martyr is a relatively commonly used term in news coverage in the Arab world.
And I think this kind of language, it's not only not objective, but it also makes these ideas sink in the head of their audience. And that's not good. At the very least, they could do just, stand at an equal distance from both sides and just either say both are martyrs or both are killed. But just, don't pick sides in this fight.
Israel recently kicked Al Jazeera out of the country in reaction to their coverage of the Gaza war.
Benjamin Netanyahu has said that his cabinet has voted unanimously on Sunday to shut down Al Jazeera offices in Israel.
Well, as you know, almost all media in the Middle East is owned by governments or by people who are close to the governments.
Correct.
It does seem to me that Al Jazeera, particularly since it was founded by a bunch of former BBC Arabic speakers, has tended to be more independent than other news organizations in the Middle East.
I don't think the other channels or newspapers are pretending to stand at a distance from their own funders and governments. Al Jazeera pretends.
So what do you make of Qatar's role in the world, in particular being at the center of this potential ceasefire agreement with Hamas?
I disagree with their school. About what's going on in Gaza, I don't support a ceasefire. And I think a ceasefire is a prescription for future war. I think if we want to be serious, we have to advocate for peace. And if we want to advocate for peace, we have to get Hamas to say that they want peace, not a ceasefire or, recognition of a Palestinian state on West Bank and Gaza without recognizing Israel. So if Hamas wants to surrender their arms and advocate for peace like the PLO did before them, I'll be, the first person to support that. But until that happens, I think ceasefire is crisis management. It will not solve the problem. And in a few years, there'll be another round, probably rounds of fighting.
What about the political wing of Hamas, which is, as you know, to a large degree based in Doha, in Qatar, and through which these negotiations about hostage releases and ceasefires have been conducted? I mean, is it a bad thing that they're in Doha, or a good thing, or it's a neutral thing, or what?
I don't really look at them as such a political wing. I mean, granted that they're not in Gaza and fighting, and now it seems that they're not calling the shots as much as they sometimes claim. So everyone now understands that whenever there's a proposal, they go looking for Sinwar, they have to find him, and sometimes they have to wait for days until they hear from him back.
Sinwar being the military leader of Hamas, who's deep underground in Gaza.
Yes. So it doesn't look to me that these guys are actually running things. But I don't think it's a net positive idea to have people advocating for the destruction of the state of Israel. to be just enjoying their time in Doha in luxury. I mean,
if they were forced out by, say, the United States or Israel or some combination or the EU, wouldn't they just go to Syria or Iran and be even harder to deal with?
Look, I'm not a fan of forcing anyone anywhere. We can just ask people to change their behavior, and then if they don't, then we think of other alternatives.
Actually, it seems that Qatar has done something a little bit like this in the recent past, leveraged its power to kick Hamas out of the country. In April, the group's leaders were forced to relocate to Turkey temporarily when talks with Israel stalled. Qatar's been funding Gaza in one way or another for years now, with the encouragement of the Israeli government, the acquiescence of the US government. So did that turn out to be sort of a giant mistake keeping Hamas afloat?
It's a terrible, bad idea to give money to organizations like Hamas or Hezbollah.
Some may criticize Qatar for playing both sides of the street, but in the end it seems that the United States, Hamas, and Israel all need this tiny country to end the seemingly endless war in Gaza. And then a coalition of countries will be needed to rebuild Gaza. Here's political scientist Mehran Kamrava.
The destruction of Gaza has been so thorough, the devastation has been so complete that it will take decades and much international effort on everybody's part to reconstruct Gaza and to put back together the lives that have been broken forever. And of course, Qatar has a role to play in that, but Qatar is by no means an only actor that can be consequential. It cannot be consequential by itself.
If you're interested in some of the issues we discussed in this episode, we recommend Mehran Kamrava's book, Qatar, Small State, Big Politics, and Rory Miller's book, Desert Kingdoms to Global Powers, The Rise of the Arab Gulf, both of whom teach at Georgetown's Qatar campus, and The Arabs, A History by Eugene Rogan, which is available on Audible. In the Room with Peter Bergen is an Audible original, produced by Audible Studios and Fresh Produce Media. This episode was produced by Laura Tillman with help from Luke Cregan and Nathan Ray. Our field producers were Ali Chris and Francois Matar. It was mixed by Bart Warshaw. Our executive producer is Alison Craiglow. Katie McMurran is our technical director. Our staff also includes Alexandra Salomon, Eric German, Holly DeMuth, Sandy Malera, and JP Swenson. Our theme music is by Joel Picard. Our executive producers for Fresh Produce Media are Colin Moore and Jason Ross. Our head of development is Julian Ambler. Our head of production is Eleanor Bavietz. Maureen Traynor is our head of operations. Our production manager is Herminio Ochoa. Our production coordinator is Henry Koch. And our delivery coordinator is Ana Paula Martinez. Audible's chief content officer is Rachel Giazza. Head of content acquisition and development and partnerships, Pat Shah. Audible executive producer, Lara Regan Kleinschmidt. Special thanks to Marlon Calby, Alison Weber, and Vanessa Harris. Copyright 2024 by Audible Originals, LLC. Sound recording copyright 2024 by Audible Originals, LLC.